The Caribbean of the second half of the 17th century was a world where naval empires, faith, and human greed collided. And it was on the southern coast of Jamaica that a city arose which came to embody all the sins and passions of its age: Port Royal. The site had been known since the days of Spanish colonization. After the island was discovered at the end of the 15th century, the Spanish settled here and used the harbor as a convenient anchorage. Its true significance, however, emerged only in the second half of the 17th century, when Jamaica fell into English hands. In 1655, an English fleet led by Admiral William Penn and General Robert Venables landed on Jamaica. At the time, the island belonged to Spain, but its defenses were weak, and the English quickly seized control of the territory. For England, locked in rivalry with the Spanish Empire for dominance in the New World, this was a decisive moment. But to hold the newly conquered island, they needed a well-defended and easily accessible base, and the southern coast offered the ideal solution. Jamaica's location was exceptional. The island lay at the crossroads of major sea routes through which Spanish wealth flowed from the Americas to Europe. Silver and gold from Peru, tobacco and coffee from the New World, enslaved people from Africa. All of it passed through the Caribbean aboard ships bound for Europe. Whoever controlled Jamaica possessed the power to protect these routes or to threaten them. Along the island's southern coast stretched a long, narrow sand spit known as the Palisados. This slender strip of land separated a deep natural harbor from the open sea. It was here that Port Royal was built. The harbor was ideal. Its deep waters allowed even the largest ships to anchor directly at the docks. Unlike many other Caribbean ports, cargo did not have to be laboriously transferred into smaller boats. And the position on the sand spit meant that ships could be defended from all sides. The English quickly recognized the value of this place. From a small fort, a city grew within just a few years. A city that became a center of trade, military power, and piracy. It was a forward base of the empire, but with a unique characteristic. In the streets of Port Royal, official authority mingled freely with the criminal underworld. The British Crown knew it could not hold Jamaica on its own. It needed allies, and those allies were privateers and pirates. A privateer, a pirate operating under royal license, could legally attack Spanish ships and share the spoils with the colonial authorities, and Port Royal was the perfect harbor for them. Here they anchored, resupplied, recruited crews, and spent their fortunes. It did not take long for the city to transform into a true stronghold of piracy. Its streets filled with merchants and soldiers, blacksmiths and innkeepers, prostitutes and smugglers. The harbor came alive so rapidly that within a single generation, Port Royal was already being described as the richest city in the Caribbean. But alongside gold and silver, power flowed through the city as well. The English governor exercised direct influence over the privateers who sailed from Port Royal against the Spanish. In return, they were allowed to resupply, trade, recruit new crews, and they shared their plunder with the colonial administration. It was a fragile but highly profitable balance. In the second half of the 17th century, Port Royal became a true haven for privateers, men who carried royal commissions in their pockets, yet in practice acted largely on their own terms. They were instruments of the English crown in its struggle against Spain, and it was through them that Port Royal grew into a city whose wealth rivaled even that of London. Every privateer who dropped anchor here brought more than gold and silver. He brought stories that almost instantly turned into legends. To the English, these men were heroes. To the Spanish, They were nothing more than criminals. The truth lay somewhere in between. The greatest star of this era was Henry Morgan. When he arrived in Jamaica in the 1660s, he was a young and ambitious Welshman. He quickly rose to command a fleet of privateers, and his daring expeditions made Port Royal famous across the world. In 1668, Morgan attacked Portobello, one of the most heavily fortified cities on the Panamanian coast. The assault was so bold and unexpected that the Spanish suffered a crushing defeat. The plunder was immense, and Morgan returned as a hero. Morgan, of course, was not alone. Other notorious privateers also sailed into the harbor. Christopher Mings, Edward Mansvelt, and Roche Braziliano among them. Each brought wealth that vanished almost immediately into taverns, gambling houses, and shops. The city lived in a constant rhythm of departing and returning fleets. These raids transformed Port Royal into an economic powerhouse. Land prices soared, merchants from Europe sent their agents, and the harbor overflowed with ships. But along with wealth, the privateers brought something else, a reputation as a city where anything was permitted. Every sailor who dreamed of quick riches dreamed of reaching Port Royal. Henry Morgan eventually rose even higher. For his campaigns, he was knighted and appointed Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica. By a cruel irony, the man who had plundered Panama's cathedral and ordered the torture of Spanish prisoners now became a representative of colonial authority. Morgan's rise symbolized the first golden age of Port Royal, a time when piracy and official power walked hand in hand, when the city became not only a symbol of English strength, but also a synonym for freedom without limits. But every glory has its price, and Port Royal's was yet to be paid. Travelers who arrived here wrote of a place where wealth vanished faster than ships could bring it in from the sea. The English preacher Thomas Trapham called Port Royal the wickedest city in the world. Spanish chroniclers gave it another name, the Sodom of the New World. Both descriptions captured the truth perfectly. Imagine the harbor bathed in tropical sunlight. Merchant ships lie at the docks as traders unload their cargo, while light pirate sloops arrive carrying stolen gold and silver. Crowds of sailors pour into the streets, pockets heavy with Spanish coins, eyes gleaming with alcohol and the promise of gambling. On nearly every corner, the doors of taverns and brothels swing open. It was said that the city held more than 100 taverns and dozens of houses of vice, for a population of barely 6,000 souls. Sailors returning from raids spent their money with feverish speed. Gold they had risked their lives to seize disappeared in a single night. The historian Charles Leslie noted, "Pirates who brought back thousands of pounds often became beggars after 2 weeks in Port Royal." Merchants, however, adapted to this rhythm with remarkable efficiency. Port Royal offered luxuries unmatched anywhere else in the Caribbean. Wines from Madeira, French silks, European jewelry. There were also goods taken as plunder, Spanish daggers, Portuguese ornaments, and exotic wares from the East. Here, pirates surrounded themselves with a level of splendor they could never have touched in London. Yet, Port Royal was not only about luxury, it was also a city of sin. Tables groaned under the weight of coins, rum flowed freely, and violence was a daily occurrence. Court records speak of dozens of murders and brawls each month. Crime and gambling were woven into everyday life. And yet, there were rules of a sort. Pirates divided their plunder according to shared codes and brotherhood agreements. It was not pure anarchy, but a community that shared both wealth and hardship. This was what set Port Royal apart from other cities. In those years, Port Royal truly was the richest city in the Caribbean. It had a higher concentration of goldsmiths, merchants, and tailors than many European cities of similar size. The children of privateers wore silk, while their fathers squandered entire fortunes in a single night of gambling. But beneath the glitter lay a darker truth. The city's wealth was built on enslaved labor. Enslaved Africans were brought to Port Royal and sold in markets like ordinary goods. The city that symbolized freedom for pirates was also a place where thousands of people lost their freedom forever. And then there was yet another paradox. Officially, the governor was meant to maintain order and protect the interests of England. In reality, the port lived by the rhythm of piracy. Governors often turned a blind eye, because they, too, profited from trade and plunder. Life in Port Royal was fast, loud, and short. Men drank, gambled, and loved as if tomorrow would never come. And for many of them, it never did. The glory of Port Royal was built on pirates, and yet, it was those very pirates who would become its downfall. By the late 1670s, the English crown began to realize that the heroes of Portobello and Panama were no longer seen across Europe as daring champions, but as dangerous criminals. England needed trade, diplomacy, and peace treaties with rival powers, and pirates stood in the way. The most powerful symbol of this shift was Henry Morgan himself. In 1671, Morgan sacked Panama, the very heart of Spanish power in Central America. The raid brought immense plunder, but it came at a terrible moment. England and Spain had already signed a peace treaty. In Port Royal, Morgan was celebrated as a hero. In London, his actions sparked an international scandal. Morgan was summoned to England to face accusations. But instead of punishment, he was knighted. He returned to the Caribbean as Sir Henry Morgan, appointed Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica. By a cruel irony of fate, the man who had once commanded pirate fleets was now tasked with suppressing piracy itself. It was a pragmatic decision. No one understood pirates better than Morgan. Under his rule, Port Royal began to change. Letters of marque grew fewer, while courts grew busier. Men who had recently celebrated in waterfront taverns now found themselves standing before tribunals. Some of the most famous pirates were tried here. Among them, Calico Jack Rackham, whose story alongside Anne Bonny and Mary Read would become legend in the golden age of piracy. Trials and executions at the gallows near the harbor were meant to send a clear message: the British crown could tame even its most rebellious servants. The port slowly transformed into a colonial city shaped by London's ideals of order and commerce. Gambling houses and brothels did not disappear, but their reputation became increasingly troublesome. Merchants who had once thrived on pirate plunder sought new paths, and many privateers moved elsewhere, especially to the Bahamas, where the pirate Republic of Nassau would soon emerge. Port Royal remained wealthy, but its golden age as the center of Caribbean piracy was drawing to a close. It was an age of paradox. Governor Morgan, himself a former pirate, still attended feasts and drank in the very taverns where he had once planned raids. And yet, as a representative of the crown, he sent his former comrades to the gallows. And although piracy was fading, Port Royal's reputation as a city of sin endured. The streets were loud, the taverns crowded, and life was lived at the same reckless pace as before. It was a city that did not know how to grow old. By the late 1680s, however, warning voices were growing louder. Preachers declared that Port Royal was a city born of sin and destined to fall. According to them, it was only a matter of time before God punished a place where wealth dissolved into blood and alcohol. But at the time, few were listening. On June 7th, 1692, shortly before noon, the city awoke to another sweltering tropical day. Ships lay anchored in the harbor, taverns opened their doors, and merchants began setting up their stalls in the streets. No one suspected that within minutes, a city that had become a symbol of wealth and sin would be reduced to ruins, and that nearly half of its population would perish. Around 11:30, the ground began to tremble. At first, only slightly, as if the sand beneath people's feet had shifted. Confused onlookers glanced around in uncertainty. Then came a second shock, far stronger than the first. Buildings began to sway, walls cracked, and moments later, the main earthquake struck. Port Royal stood on a narrow, sandy spit, unstable ground that loses its strength during seismic activity. Modern geologists describe this phenomenon as soil liquefaction. But to the people of the time, it felt like the wrath of God itself. Entire districts collapsed into the sea, streets split apart, and houses vanished beneath the water. People fled in terror, screaming, but had nowhere to escape. One witness wrote that the earth opened and swallowed whole houses together with those inside them. Within minutes, the harbor pier collapsed. Ships that had been moored safely at the shoreline were dragged into the sea. Water surged through the streets, carrying debris from buildings, barrels of rum, and lifeless bodies. The shaking itself lasted barely 2 minutes, but the consequences were apocalyptic. 2/3 of the city disappeared beneath the waves. Of roughly 6,000 inhabitants, around 2,000 died instantly, with hundreds more succumbing in the following days to injuries, hunger, and disease. Port Royal, once the pride of the English Caribbean, had become a mass grave. Contemporary accounts describe scenes of unimaginable horror. One English officer wrote, "I saw a man standing in the street when the ground split beneath him and he vanished into the depths. Moments later, his lifeless body floated to the surface among the wreckage of houses." Other witnesses claimed that the sea swallowed entire ships as if they were toys. For many, the catastrophe was clear proof that Port Royal had been punished for its sins. The preacher, Emmanuel Heath, who survived the disaster, wrote, "God grew angry with this city of vice and, in a single moment, displayed his power." But the horror did not end there. Coastal fortifications began to collapse. The wounded lay trapped beneath rubble, and floodwaters ruined food stores. Looters took advantage of the chaos, robbing homes, and even the dead. Records speak of murders committed for a gold ring or a bottle of rum. In the days that followed, disease spread rapidly. Bodies decomposed in the tropical heat, drinking water became contaminated, and outbreaks of dysentery and fever swept through the survivors. Those who had endured the earthquake now died from illness and starvation. And then, as if the destruction were not yet complete, tsunami waves struck the coast. According to eyewitnesses, a wave followed the initial shock, sweeping away debris and people alike, dragging them out to sea. The devastation was total. The English crown attempted to send aid, but the journey across the Atlantic took many long weeks. In the meantime, survivors lived in makeshift camps. Without shelter, without supplies, and without hope. The catastrophe of 1692 was not merely an earthquake. It was a tragedy that brought the age of pirate Port Royal to an end. When the dust and floodwaters finally settled, only half of what had once been called the most sinful city in the world remained, and even that lay in ruins. Those who survived attempted to rebuild, but the spirit of Port Royal had been broken forever. The governor of Jamaica reported to London that the harbor could not be completely abandoned. Its position was simply too strategic, and so Port Royal remained a military outpost, but it would never regain its former glory. After aid arrived from England, the city did partially recover. Docks were rebuilt, taverns reopened, and trade resumed. Yet Port Royal no longer felt like a proud symbol of piracy. It resembled a city of ghosts. Its reputation as a place where anything was allowed faded, replaced by the belief that it was a city chosen by God for punishment. Nature offered no mercy. 11 years later, in 1703, a great fire swept through the town. 4 years after that, a hurricane devastated the harbor and sank ships at anchor. In the 1720s, further earthquakes and storms struck, once again destroying large parts of the settlement. Each generation of Port Royal endured a new catastrophe. Merchants who had once grown wealthy there began to leave. Attention shifted to Kingston, founded after the earthquake on the opposite side of the bay. Built on more stable ground and offering better conditions, Kingston gradually assumed the role of Jamaica's main center. Pirates, too, had no reason to return. While Port Royal had been their base in the 17th century, after 1700 the center of piracy moved to the Bahamas. Nassau emerged as the new pirate republic, while Port Royal sank into obscurity. The city once known as the capital of pirates became a fortress of the British Navy, quiet, orderly, and disciplined. Barracks, churches, and warehouses rose upon the ruins of the former city of sin. Places where tables once groaned beneath piles of gold were now guarded by military patrols. A city that had symbolized anarchy was transformed into a stronghold of order. 18th century travelers described Port Royal as a small village haunted by the shadows of its former glory. Stories of excess and pirate freedom were told only in taverns, and even those stories had largely moved to Kingston. Port Royal still existed on the map, but its legend lived elsewhere. In the end, the warnings of the preachers came true. A city built on sin, they said, could not endure. Whether its fate was shaped by divine will or by the relentless forces of nature, the outcome was the same. From one of the richest and most vibrant places in the Caribbean, Port Royal became a ruin, a silent reminder of its own past.